Welcome everyone this evening to the webinar, A Last Resort Argument for God from Evil with Paul Copan. Paul, welcome tonight, or well, I think it's the day actually. It's during the day, afternoon probably for you. But any, excuse me?
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. Yes. Welcome. I'm very glad that you can be with us today and not only with us present, but doing this presentation. And for those of you who might not know Paul, Paul is the Pleasure Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University, West Palm Beach, Florida. And for 6 years, he served as president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. He is an author and editor of over 30 books, including works such as The Rationality of Theism, The Routledge Companion to Philosophy of Religion, Creation Out of Nothing, Philosophy of Religion, Classic and Contemporary Issues, The Zondervan Dictionary of Christianity and Science, A Little Book for New Philosophers, and The Cosmological Argument, a 2-volume anthology. He has also contributed essays to over 30 books, both scholarly and popular, and has authored a number of articles in professional journals. In 2017, he was a visiting scholar at Oxford University. Paul and his wife, Jacqueline, have 6 children and then reside in West Palm Beach, Florida. So, Paul, once again, welcome to this webinar, and thank you for taking the time for this presentation. And for all of you participants, I just wanted to let you know that I will be here the whole time to provide with any technical support or anything necessary to keep this webinar going. So if you're experiencing any issues or any problems, please let me know either through the chat or through an email, and I'll be glad to at least try to help you. And I think that's all from me. So Paul, you can start.
Sounds good. I appreciate it. Thank you, Jose. Well, I'm glad to have you all with me today to talk about the problem of evil. And what I want to do is present another angle on the problem of evil. And maybe you've heard some of these things already articulated, but I wanted to bring together a last resort argument for God from evil. You see, every worldview has to grapple with evil. It's not just the Christian. Every worldview has to address how do we make sense of evil given our own worldview. And so what I want to do is present how the Christian faith actually does a better job of addressing the problem of evil, despite the fact that it's a problem for every worldview, and how the Christian faith is a more plausible alternative for an explanation than the alternative. So we can start with David Hume, who said, "Were a stranger on a sudden into the world, it would show him a specimen of its ills, a hovel of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors and debtors, a field of battle strewed with carcasses, a fleet foundering in the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, or pestilence." He says, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence, then, is evil? So here we have David Hume raising the question of evil back in the 18th century. We have Marilyn McCord Adams, who died fairly recently, but this Christian philosopher talked about these paradigmatic horrors that she lists. Says, I offer the following list of paradigmatic horrors: the rape of a woman and axing off of her arms, psychophysical torture whose ultimate goal is the disintegration of personality, betrayal of one's deepest loyalties, cannibalizing one's own offspring, child abuse of the sort described by Ivan Karamazov, a mother who beats her 7-year-old girl, or a 5-year-old boy forced to sleep outside and eat excrement, child pornography, parental incest, slow death by starvation, participation in the Nazi death camps, having to choose which of one's children shall live and which will be executed by terrorists. I regard these as paradigmatic because I believe most people would find in the doing or suffering of them prima facie reason to doubt the positive meaning of their lives. So that's quite a list. We see terrible things that have been done that people continue to carry out. And we ask the question with David Hume, is God powerful? Well, why doesn't he stop these things? Is God good? Well, how then do we account for the emergence of evil if God is both powerful and good? I received a letter back in November from a pastor in Colorado. He says, I'm withdrawing from serving in the church. He says, I have some questions regarding the pervasiveness of evil and why does God put up with letting Satan have his way? Especially in light of his love for children, why does he allow child abduction and sexual abuse? And the list goes on. So when does God intervene on behalf of the saints and the defenseless? And is he really nearby and motivated by our prayers that seem to go unanswered? I was an ordained elder for a local evangelical church. I was a student of Bible and theology at a certain school, serving in ministry, reading and teaching God's word, and was a champion of the gospel message for all those years. But about 5 years ago, a 10-year-old girl was raped and brutally murdered, her body dismembered by a demented high school student who lived in the same neighborhood. She was a guest of our church, whose neighbor across the street brought her to Sunday school with her daughter and was told she trusted in Jesus as her Savior on one of those visits. The girl's mom was invited many times but wasn't interested in checking out our church. After her death, we memorialized her death and visited with her mom many times to try to comfort her, but to no avail. She wanted to know where was God to protect her precious daughter. We didn't have an answer. It was then that my faith began to question many things about God's presence or lack of it, having the same question that she had. All my training and studying of his word has left me wondering, why doesn't God feel like we do? Why isn't he more active battling evil in the world? Why does he allow Satan to have control for so long? What is the greater purpose for all of this suffering? I'm well aware and in awe of Christ's suffering. I am forever grateful that the Lord reached out of heaven to reveal himself to me and save me by his grace through faith after believing in his message of salvation. But I'm withdrawing from serving because I don't have these answers. And I wonder what kind of God would let this little girl die like this? And so many others like her throughout the world every day. Can you help me, Paul, see what is clouding my faith? Thank you, brother. Well, as it turns out, I was able to speak with this pastor shortly after he emailed me, and then was able to visit him in Colorado in November, and to work through some things that I have found helpful, both in pastoral ministry as well as philosophically, biblically. And so some of the things that I passed on to him, I want to share with you all. And also I think it's important that we remember that the scriptures themselves don't guarantee that we will be free from pain. This is a false view that God's existence, that God's presence, and God's being our Father somehow guarantees that we will be free from suffering, free from trouble, free from anguish. We hear Jesus telling us in John 16:33, he said, in this world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. We read over and over again, both in the Old and New Testaments, that God's people are often afflicted. They're suffering, they're persecuted, they're put to death. And God doesn't promise that he's going to deliver us from every evil. Sometimes he does. But we also recognize that even in the end, we will not be delivered unless the Lord returns. We will not be delivered from death itself. And so there are just a number of things that are required for us to get straight biblically. Now that we need to remember that what God's word promises and what it doesn't promise. So we should lean on false promises And so often we think that we ought to know the answer to the question why when we simply aren't guaranteed any sort of answer like that. So those are a few preliminary comments before we get into our discussion. But again, the point is this, that despite the prevalence of evil, to abandon the biblical understanding of God is to cut ourselves off from the most robust resources available for responding to the problem of evil. So this is where we're going to go. We're going to talk about, first of all, the recognition of evil. We're going to talk about evil in common sense there, then look at the definition of evil, then the presupposition of evil, the reparation of evil, the argumentation on evil, offering some responses to common arguments that are given, and then redemption from evil, and the resolution to evil, as well as action against evil, and then volition concerning evil. So that's our basic outline. We'll unpack those things. Some of these bullet points may seem a little obscure at the moment, but the basic point here is that we want to address how the Christian faith better stands up under scrutiny than do the alternatives. That basically if we get rid of God, then we're left with far more problems, not fewer problems. So we need to remember what the right questions are to ask. As I said, every worldview has to grapple with the problem of evil. And we need to be asking what worldview offers us the best resources for responding to the problem of evil. Not which worldview answers all of our questions regarding evil. We aren't in a position to affirm that, but we can at least ask which worldview offers the best resources for addressing the problem of evil. The wrong question to ask, and as I alluded to this earlier, we so often set ourselves up for disappointment because we ask, why did God allow this? And we assume that we ought to have some sort of an answer here. Whereas when Jesus was asked the question of why, for example, Galileans were killed in the temple under Pontius Pilate's order, so that their blood was mingled with the sacrifices, Jesus said, do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than the rest? I tell you no, but unless you repent, you will likewise perish. And then he goes on to talk about a tower falling killing 18 Israelites, and he asks, well, were they worse sinners than the rest? And Jesus said, no, there wasn't. So he wasn't saying the reason that this happened was because of that. He doesn't give us any sort of an answer, but rather it provided an occasion for his hearers to assess their own relationship with God, to make sure that they were right with God. Unless you repent, you will likewise perish. And as C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. That God, he whispers to us in our pleasures, he speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts to us in our pain. And so often when nothing else will get our attention, it is often the problem of evil, natural evils, for example, that will arrest us, that will awaken us. And we find out that we've been depending upon our own resources and realize that we need to cast ourselves upon God's strength and God's mercy. So this is what we'll do. I'll go through each of the sections of this presentation, and then I'll pause for questions. And Jose is going to be giving some of your questions that we'll go through after each section. So just keep that in mind. If there's some things, maybe something's not clear or you'd like something to be addressed, we can tackle that. So again, we'll just go through first of all each section, and then take each set of questions as they come, and then we'll have a bit more of a dynamic engagement on the presentation. So here we go. First of all, as we look at the problem of evil, we need to remember that the Christian faith is at a fundamental advantage here compared to other worldviews that ultimately deny the reality of evil. We get that evil is real, that there are terrible things that happen in the world, but there are some worldviews that actually deny the reality of evil. And so we have to ask the question, well, why should we deny what seems so obvious to us? Well, here's, for example, Richard Dawkins, who says, if the universe were just selfish genes and electrons and selfish genes, it would be neither evil nor good in intention. Basically, the universe is what we would expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So there's this naturalistic worldview. And of course, Bertrand Russell says much the same thing, basically that we're in a world of accidental collocations or arrangements of atoms. And we're basically the product of these blind forces. And he basically, unless we adopt this philosophy, he says all these things, you know, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on this, get this, the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be built. So you have two naturalistic viewpoints that fundamentally deny the reality of evil. There is no good or evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So that's a Western naturalistic viewpoint. Again, the question, in light of our own experience, our own, what we've faced in life, the evils that we've seen, does it make sense to deny them? Well, the naturalistic worldview says, well, I mean, some people are more optimistic in their naturalism, which I would think is misguided. But I think the consistent naturalist is going to have to deny both good and evil in light of the fundamental starting point of his worldview, that we're just simply the arrangements of atoms. Well, there's also an Eastern viewpoint again, here we have, a denial of the reality of evil according to, say, this Zen Buddhist scholar from the International House of Japan. Arthur Koestler, after the Second World War, went to Japan and visited there, and he was asking this Zen Buddhist scholar, Buddhism lays great stress on truth. Why should a man tell the truth when it may be to his advantage to lie? Because it is simpler, the Zen Buddhist said. Someone else tried another tack. You favor tolerance toward all religions and all political systems. What about Hitler's gas chambers? The Zen Buddhist scholar said, that was very silly of him. Just silly and not evil, they replied. The Buddhist scholar said, evil is a Christian concept. Good and evil exist only on a relative scale. So fundamentally, this worldview denies that there's any real evil that exists. It's only relative. So does it make better sense to adopt here the biblical understanding that evil really does exist, or take the naturalistic viewpoint, according to Dawkins, that evil really does not exist, or the Eastern Zen Buddhist viewpoint that, again, evil is just something that is really ultimately just very silly, but nothing more? Well, here the Christian faith is at an advantage. It accepts what even atheists take for granted. It takes for granted that evil really does exist, and that evil is something that God is addressing and is going to, through Jesus Christ in particular, to make all things new and to wipe away all tears, and to make sure that matters are, of evil are addressed and not let go or going unpunished. So at the very minimum, the Christian faith has this going for it. It doesn't deny this pervasive problem of evil that some other worldviews do. As we've seen, the Christian faith takes evil seriously. Here again, the Christian faith is at an advantage because there is a basis for affirming the objectivity of evil. Evil isn't just something that, well, I just feel bad or I don't like. Evil is something that we recognize presupposes a standard. Evil is fundamentally a departure from the way things ought to be. And again, we're pointed in the direction of God in using that kind of language. Evil assumes a design plan, a way things ought to be. When people complain against God, for example, because there's evil in the world, it assumes that things are not right, that something is wrong, something is amiss, something should not be this way. But again, that assumes that things ought to be a certain way. When we say this ought not to have happened, it brings us right into the subject of evil. Think of counterfeit money. Evil presupposes a kind of standard or design plan. Now, some people, you may have heard people saying this, that, well, you can't have good unless you have evil, and you can't have evil unless you have good. You need both of them. Not so. Just think of counterfeit money. Can you have real or authentic currency without counterfeit money? Well, sure. But counterfeit money makes no sense unless you have real currency. So you can have one that is real currency without the other, but you can't have the counterfeit unless you have the real. And the same applies to evil. You can have goodness without evil, but you can't have evil unless there's already a standard of goodness or some sort of a design plan by which we judge something to be evil. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, when he was an atheist, he said, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found that I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. The Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga raises the question, could there really be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if naturalism were true? I don't see how. A naturalistic way of looking at the world, so it seems to me, has no place for genuine moral obligation of any sort. A fortiori, then, it has no place for such a category as horrifying wickedness. He says there could only be such a thing only if there is a way rational creatures are supposed to live. He says, but naturalism cannot make room for that kind of normativity. That requires a lawgiver, one whose very nature it is to abhor wickedness. Naturalism can perhaps accommodate foolishness and irrationality. It can't accommodate appalling wickedness. Accordingly, if you think that there really is such a thing as horrifying wickedness, that our sense that there is not some mere illusion of some sort, then if you also think that the main options are theism and naturalism, then you have a powerful theistic argument from evil. So again, we have not only the biblical faith that gives to us the assumption, takes for granted the very reality of evil, but there's also a presumption of a standard by which to determine or judge something to be evil, namely a standard of goodness, a kind of design plan, a way things ought to be. Now, some people might be wondering, well, what do you mean by naturalism? Well, just think of these three fundamental tenets or pillars of naturalism. The first is materialism, that matter is the only reality that there is. Determinism, that each event is a result of prior physical forces, going all the way back to, say, the Big Bang. And then finally, scientism, that science alone, or best, gives us knowledge. Now, those are the three pillars of naturalism. And I'd say when people start to bring in other things like goodness and rationality and so forth, they're actually going beyond what naturalism actually allows us to affirm. But again, we'll skip on ahead here. Naturalism, as one philosopher, Jae-Gwon Kim, says, is imperialistic. It demands full coverage and exacts a terribly high ontological or metaphysical price. What he's saying here is that if you're going to be a true naturalist, you're going to have to count the cost. just like Jesus talked about sitting down and counting the cost, the naturalist is going to have to sit down and count the cost. You're going to have to get rid of things like human dignity. You're going to have to get rid of free will. You're going to have to get rid of beauty. You're going to have to get rid of moral duties. You're going to have to get rid of a whole host of things that we take to be part of our own humanness. But the naturalist is going to have to repudiate those fundamental things that we take for granted. So again, he's acknowledging that it is not a worldview to embrace by the faint-hearted, that it is something that is very stark, very radical, and something that will require denying what we take so fundamental to our own human condition and experience. Now, again, there are some people who try to be broad naturalists rather than the strict naturalism that we've been talking about. So they want to hang on to intrinsic dignity, moral duties, personal responsibility, self-consciousness, the existence of beauty and so forth. But they're actually going beyond naturalism and clinging to transcendent standards, objective values that are independent of the natural world. We're actually looking in the direction of God, something beyond this realm to hang on to, because the natural world itself can't supply those things. The broad naturalist will have to affirm that it has two problems to work with, namely the problem of evil. As I said, every worldview has to deal with the problem of evil, but also the problem of goodness. Where does goodness come from at all, by which we judge something to be evil? The theist says, understand goodness because goodness is rooted in the character of God. God is by very nature good. It deviates from that would be evil. But again, the naturalist doesn't even have a foothold, a starting point, a beachhead by which to explain how evil could even exist, because he doesn't have that kind of a design plan, that kind of blueprint by which we judge something to be a departure from the way things ought to be. Keep this in mind as well, that evil, which is the leading anti-theistic argument, turns out to be an argument for God's existence. So we actually have a way of affirming God's existence based on the reality of evil. So if objective moral values exist, then God most likely exists. And evil exists, and of course evil is an objective moral value. Therefore, God most likely exists. Again, if we get rid of God, we get rid of the design plan, we get rid of the blueprint, we get rid of the way things ought to be. And so we actually have an affirmation of the existence of God from evil. Let me just pause and see if there are any questions that have come up and any things that you'd care to chat about.
Yes, there's one question by Elke. Actually, it was asked just as we were moving on to this second part. So the question is, in my conversations with atheist agnostics, they are unwilling to even consider a biblical perspective. How do you argue?
Well, I think it might be helpful to ask them, well, what perspective do you have to give on the problem of evil? Notice here that I haven't even really appealed to Scripture. I've simply talked about the very existence of evil. And I would ask, well, how do you account for the very existence of evil, given your worldview as an atheist or an agnostic? I would say, secondly, you have, not only do you have the problem of evil to deal with yourself, but also where does that standard come from? See, you don't even have to quote the Bible. You can just say, well, what sort of a standard do you have by which to judge something to be evil? It sounds like you have an understanding of a way things ought to be. But if nature is all that there is, then there is no way things ought to be. Things just are what they are. So it's important for us to recognize that even if people don't accept the authority of Scripture, we can still offer some philosophical arguments that challenge the way that they think. And again, we'll do more of that. But again, why not take the viewpoint of Richard Dawkins, who says there is no good or evil? I think he's being consistent with his own worldview. And so again, begin there. I think you can talk about how the how we have good philosophical resources for responding to the agnostic and the atheist. But you can say these sorts of things are supplemented also and filled out by a God who reveals himself in Jesus Christ, who actually comes to address the problem of evil, who guarantees that things will be set right in the end, that create a new world in which justice dwells, in which evil does not dwell. So there's a God who exists who has actually done something about it. So again, you can add to that, but again, at a very fundamental philosophical level. I think the agnostic and the atheist don't have a solid foundation by which to address the problem of evil. They're not giving us an alternative here that is more plausible than, say, the existence of a good God. So anyway, that's where I'd begin.
There's another question. How do we argue that evil is morally wrong in the objective sense?
Well, I think that if you don't get the problem of evil, then I'd say, for example, if you really think that there's no difference between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler, I'd say you probably need to think more deeply about these issues. If you think that, even the atheist Kai Nielsen said, a person who doesn't think that wife beating and child abuse is wrong hasn't probed deeply enough into the foundations of his own moral beliefs. And I would certainly agree with that there are some things that if you don't get, remember, think of those paradigmatic horrors, a woman who is raped and dismembered. I think you just ask the question, do you think that you really think that isn't evil? When a parent is told to choose which child should live and which child should die, under a terrorist threat, do you think that is not evil? I think we can come up with lots of examples of these paradigmatic horrors that Marilyn Adams, for example, gave and go well beyond that. But when people don't see these things as deeply disturbing, not just, this doesn't make me feel good, but again, this is objectively wrong. I'd say, I really do think that you need help. These things are not just eccentric or odd. These things are profoundly evil, that they do damage, they unravel human personhood, whether you're a perpetrator or whether you're a victim. And so again, I think there's just a basic seeing of these things. We get it. We don't need an argument for these sorts of things. We see very readily that these deep evils exist. And so I would simply say, if you don't get this, then you're actually not getting what a lot of atheists themselves get when they use this argument against God's existence. So atheists get it. Many people throughout the world get it. They see evil as, again, a fundamental reality in the world. You think of the Holocaust, you think of the killing fields of Cambodia, you think of the Holodomor, the forced famine in the Ukraine. My grandfather died in that famine. And a whole host of things that we can list that people recognize. Well, we have before us something that seems so intuitively obvious that the burden would be on the person who denies these realities than the vast majority of people who recognize, who get it, that this is actually something that damages us as human beings, whether you're a perpetrator or a victim of these things. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful. Again, we can come back to some of these questions, but why don't we move on then to our next set of issues, the presupposition of evil. Evil is, typically when people raise the problem of evil, they take for granted human value or worth. Of course, the scriptures affirm that human beings are made in the image of God. But if there is no God, it's hard to see how valuable beings could emerge from valueless processes. Where do we get value, objective value, from valueless processes? Again, here, the biblical faith makes excellent sense of this, but it's hard to see how value could arise given a naturalistic worldview, for example. So, as we look at this, let's, I'm kind of stuck here, trying to advance my PowerPoint, but it's not moving. There we go. So, without God, fundamentally, there's no ultimate significance to life. Why is that? Well, think of value. Our objective value as human beings is highly probable if God, a supremely valuable being, exists. It's also highly improbable given a context of valuelessness, mindless material processes, that value should emerge. What about things like human rights? Human rights presuppose a certain objectivity that they should not be violated, but it's kind of puzzling. It's kind of strange if naturalism is true, but if God exists, then this makes excellent sense. We've been made in the image of God. What about the issue of purpose? Without God, there's fundamentally no cosmic purpose. And so our deepest desire for perfect happiness or joy, as the scriptures talk about it, will be unattainable if we're limited to this life alone. The person who's doing the right thing, we'll talk about this later, a person who's doing the right thing throughout his life may end up, like a Mother Teresa, who lived self-sacrificially, caring for the poor and so forth, but she herself felt like God was absent, that she felt that she did not have the joy that again, we would even perhaps expect her to have. But if God doesn't exist, then there could be, there is no ultimate reward, no ultimate joy, no ultimate happiness for someone like Mother Teresa. Her end is just absurd. There is no coming together of the moral or virtuous life and happiness. She is thwarted in that. But God's existence removes that kind of absurdity. So those are a few things to consider. The presupposition of evil is a little bit of a shorter section. Evil presupposes human worth and value and significance. But again, naturalism doesn't give us any sort of basis for affirming this kind of value and dignity and so forth. And we also talk about even various viewpoints. We talk about Aristotle, who believed that some people are born to rule and other people are born slaves, and he called slaves animate tools, animated tools. And they were just born that way, and that there was no fundamental equality between these, say, groups of human beings. Same thing with the Hindu caste system. If you're a Brahmin at the top of the caste system, then you have power, you have dignity, unlike those who are the Dalits, who don't have any status, don't have dignity, and there's no fundamental equality that is affirmed there. So again, the biblical faith actually makes sense out of that common understanding that we have, again, held by many throughout the world, that there's a fundamental equality to human beings, a fundamental dignity, human rights, and so forth. Any questions from you all on this? Happy to engage with you. Otherwise, we'll just move ahead. All right. I guess we'll just keep going then. Okay. Here's the next point to make, that the existence of God presents the best hope for addressing the moral gap, the reparation of evil. You see, there's a moral gap that exists between our own ethical ideals, or even our own ethical ideals, and our capacity to achieve those ethical ideals. What the scriptures call grace. We need outside assistance. We need something beyond our own resources. And it's interesting that that gap that is acknowledged not just by, quote, religious systems, but also secular systems as well. That there's an acknowledgement that human beings are flawed, human beings fall short, human beings can't live up to the standards that they themselves profess, the ideals that they acknowledge. And John Hare has written a book called The Moral Gap that actually again, is a good theistic Christian philosopher. C.S. Lewis recognized this. He looked at his own life. He said, when it comes to self-examination, he said, for the first time I examined myself with a serious practical purpose, and there I found what appalled me. There I found a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. My name was Legion. He saw within himself deep inadequacy, evil, sin, human flaws. And again, he fell short of the standard. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he said, he survived Soviet labor camps. He said, gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil, not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years. Even within hearts over evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. Think any of us who have any self-knowledge will recognize just how on target Alexander Solzhenitsyn is. That there is this fundamental flaw that exists, and that we recognize that we fall short of this fundamental standard. All right, and there's another quotation from Elie Wiesel. Deep down, man is not only an executioner, not only a victim, not only a spectator, he is all three at once. So, what is there to repair of the human condition? How do we deal with the deep lack within our own selves, the evil that we find bound up within us? G.K. Chesterton wrote about this, asked in response to the question of London with the world. G.K. Chesterton wrote, "Dear Sir, I am yours, G.K. Chesterton." He recognized the fundamental flaw begins with us. That is what is wrong with the world. Here's, I think, a wonderful quotation from Francis Spufford, a former atheist, on why he abandoned atheism. He said, "Atheism turned out not to contain what my soul needed for nourishment in bad times. It was not any kind of philosophical process that led me out from disbelief. I had made a mess of in my life, and I needed mercy, and to my astonishment, mercy was there. And the rest followed from there." It was not just this experience of mercy, but rather the idea, not just an idea of mercy, it was the experience of mercy. He said, "I felt my way back to Christianity, rediscovering through many surprises that the religion I remembered from my childhood looked different if you came to it as an adult with adult needs. Not pretty, not small, not ridiculous, but tough and gigantic and marvelous." I think a lot of people who leave the Christian faith, I think they haven't looked at it as Francis Spufford has. They grow up with all sorts of false impressions, false ideas about the Christian faith, false expectations, and they don't realize the amazing resources that there are available in the Christian faith. Which worldview can address that problem of needing mercy? How do I deal with my guilt? How do I deal with my shame? Well, Francis Spufford found that his own atheism just did not give him the resources to address these profound inner existential problems. Well, let's move on here to the next segment on the argumentation from evil. See, key arguments from evil can actually be challenged. So whereas people think, oh, here's an argument against God from evil, we can actually push back and say, no, the Christian faith can actually hold its own when it comes to dealing with the problem of evil on various arguments. You may be familiar with the distinction between the emotional and the philosophical problems of evil. The emotional from evil says that I feel that a good God couldn't exist given my state of suffering or the suffering that I see in the world. And So we feel emotionally weighed down by this. Now, the response to this is not so much intellectual argument, although that can help, but primarily pastoral care and personal presence and comfort. Bringing over the dinner to someone who is suffering, who's just buried a loved one. That's the emotional argument. Kind of what Job's friends did. They sat down for 7 days and just sat with him in silence. It was only when they opened their mouths that the problem began. But while they sat with him, they're doing what was needed. They're addressing the emotional problem of evil. There's the logical argument. Again, the emotional argument, some people just say, I can't believe in a God who makes me feel or allows me to feel this way. Well, that's not really an argument. But again, there is a deep, deep sense that needs, deep feeling that needs to be addressed. And so that's the emotional issue. The logical issue is more the philosophical. Here, the philosophical, problem of evil is addressed in the logical argument. Now, David Hume, we saw, he assumed that if God is all good and all powerful, then evil cannot exist. But the response would be that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils that he does. So there's no logical contradiction between an all good and all powerful God existing and evil existing. If God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils he does, then the problem evaporates. But beyond that, the problem gets messier for the atheist or the naturalist. The naturalist will acknowledge, or most of them have acknowledged, that the logical argument against, from evil, against God does not work. And even atheists themselves recognize that the logical argument from evil is inadequate, it is bankrupt. But the atheist has to go to, say, the probabilistic problem of evil. They'll say that it may be logically possible that God and evil coexist, but it's highly improbable. Well, the response, to saying that it's highly improbable that God exists in light of evil is to say that we're not in the best position to determine that this is the case. Just because I don't know what God's possible reasons are for permitting evil doesn't mean that they don't exist. I'm just not well positioned to know what those reasons are. God, who sees the full and big picture, doesn't make known to me what those specific reasons are for permitting the evils that he does. You see, another problem here is that if we only look at the problem of evil, then God's existence will seem much less likely. So yeah, sure, God's existence may seem much more improbable if we only look at evil, but consider the full scope of evidence for God's existence. What are some of those reasons for thinking God exists? Well, the universe began to exist a finite time ago. The universe, the Big Bang, as modern science talks about it, 13.8 billion years ago, the universe began to exist a finite time ago. We also know that the universe was wound up. We know from the second law of thermodynamics that that energy is spreading out, it's dissipating. And so if, as Paul Davies, the physicist, says, if the universe is winding down, then it has been wound up. Matter is not eternal. Energy is not eternal. It had a beginning point. If the universe were eternal, then all energy would be dissipated or spread out by now and no longer usable. There's also the fine-tuning of the universe. The universe is life-permitting. It's also life-producing as well as life-sustaining. And again, these are significant conditions that need to be met before human beings can even show up on the scene. Just because you have a universe doesn't mean that it's going to be life-permitting. Just because you have a life-permitting universe, again, which requires all sorts of intricate conditions, that doesn't guarantee that it's going to produce life. But even if you do get to the point of producing life, that still doesn't guarantee that life is going to be sustained from a single-celled organism all the way to humans or Homo sapiens. There's also the existence of consciousness. Well, I think that consciousness comes out of non-conscious matter. Or rationality. Well, I think that rationality should come out of non-rational processes. Or that free will should emerge, or personal responsibility should emerge from deterministic processes. Or why I think that beauty should emerge from these, again, blind, deterministic material forces. Or human dignity. Why I think that human value should emerge Or moral duties. Why I think that we should have duties if we're simply the products of these blind deterministic forces. And we can also go beyond that to appeal to historical evidences for the resurrection of Jesus and so forth. So if God exists, we can say he wouldn't allow any pointless evil, but God does exist, and therefore he would not allow any utterly pointless evil. So again, we can offer these sorts of arguments. So again, we have to ask the question, are we in the best position to determine whether God could have a morally justifiable reason for permitting evil? You see, what if evil is just inscrutable or mysterious rather than being gratuitous or unnecessary? A lot of people confuse inscrutability and gratuity. Inscrutability has to do with the mystery of evil, but just because evil is mysterious to us doesn't mean that there aren't reasons for God permitting evil. So we shouldn't jump from saying, if there isn't a reason that I can think of, therefore there must not be a reason. That's a faulty inference. So I think we have a comment here. Jose, do you want to walk us through that?
Yeah, there's a question. Is it correct that even some of the people who proclaim atheism and hate religions agree with us without any higher divine authority? It's really hard to decide what is right or what is wrong.
You are right. There are a number of naturalists who would agree that if you get rid of God, then there is no basis for affirming goodness on any other grounds, that nature itself can't supply us the grounds. If you appeal to some sort of a Platonism, like Eric Wielenberg does, he's an atheistic philosopher who says, no, you can't ground goodness or objective moral, objective moral truth in in nature. You've got to have a transcendent or a non-natural basis for that. And so he's basically arguing that there are these moral facts that almost are pre-existing human beings, and eventually human beings evolve, and coincidentally, great cosmic coincidence, their moral constitution actually corresponds to those moral facts that have been awaiting them, as it were. It's as though they've been anticipating them. Now, I'd say that is kind of an odd conjunction. Again, it's just a cosmic coincidence here. Now, if God exists, if God is the standard of objective goodness, and we are made in the image of God, then there is no cosmic accident here that brings those two together. No, there's an organic unity that brings them together. And again, there are many atheists who in the past have acknowledged that if there is no God, then you don't have objective moral values. People like J.L. Mackie, philosopher from Oxford University, said that if objective moral values do exist, then these would actually be an argument for God's existence, but he ended up rejecting them. Jean-Paul Sartre said, without God, we don't have any basis for any sort of moral goodness. Friedrich Nietzsche, there's a philosopher by the name of Joel Marx who said he used to hang on to the idea that there could be this moral goodness even without God, but he said, no, the religious fundamentalists are right, that if there is no God, no objective moral value. So he had to change his view on that. And again, we can go to many other people, and I'm often giving a presentation called the Natural Declaring the Glory of God, in which I show these quotations from various naturalists who actually affirm what Christians have been saying all along, that if there is no God, as Dostoevsky said, then everything is permitted, that you don't have a basis for affirming human dignity, you don't have a basis for affirming human free will and moral responsibility, you don't have a basis for affirming moral duties and so forth. These things make excellent, robust sense if God exists, but again, it's hard to account for those things when you don't have a God to ground those. So yeah, I certainly affirm that is the case. Well, looks like there's another question here. Jose, I see this. I'll just read the question. Okay, I'll just up here. It says, can we say anything about the fact that no matter where we situate ourselves on the subject, we will use logical reasoning to entertain the debate? Who claims ownership for the logical apparatus? Does this matter in the debate? Why do all accept these logical laws? Well, I think that one of the issues is there is a fundamental objectivity to logic. If we reject logical laws, we'll use logical laws to reject them. Now, they're just basic fundamental laws of logic, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, etc. So or the law of excluded middle, basic logical laws that if you say, well, who are you to say that your logical laws should be preferred? Well, it's not as though it's a matter of preferring them or that one set of logical laws is better than another. I mean, we use these logical laws all the time. We use logical laws even in our very language. Language presupposes logical laws, that we distinguish one word from another, one part of speech, preposition or object of the preposition or something like that, from other parts of speech in a sentence, subject, verb, etc. So again, we will apply logical laws. Logical laws are fundamental to rationality. So any sort of debate, any sort of argument is going to presuppose those laws. So that's where I begin. It's not as though there's some sort of a high ground here. I think we all get that these logical laws exist, that rationality exists, and that we want to avoid contradicting ourselves when we are arguing for a point, or we want to avoid being arbitrary and simply saying, well, because I said so. That doesn't establish your point. We want to give reasons for why our point should be taken over against, say, our opponent's viewpoint. So again, those are some things that I would say in response to the issue of logical laws. All right, well, let's, oh, here's another one. We have one of the biggest problems from my interlocutors is, where does evil come from? Is God is good? Who created evil? What do you think? Well, I would point you to, I mean, I've done a bit of writing on this, and a popular level version of this you could read. It was published in Enrichment Journal. It's called, it basically is on how, if God, how could evil arise in a very good world? Basically, what I argue here is that human beings who are created with freedom are given the opportunity, the free choice. Again, they're not necessarily good beings. They're contingently good beings made in the image of God. And so that means that they can choose to side with God or choose to side with evil, with going against the command that God has issued. So in doing so, what think of Adam and Eve. It's not as though God created something that was maybe a little evil and that human beings latched onto it. No, God created things that were good. The problem comes in when human beings choose a lesser good, like, for example, focusing on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, rather than focusing on the ultimate good or the greatest good, namely God. They slowly but surely came to doubt the goodness of God. They came to wonder whether God really is good. They came to focus on the commandment or the prohibition that God had regarding the tree, that you're not to eat of it. Think of how Eve said, we can't even touch it. Well, God didn't say that. But again, that seemed to be the focal point. That seemed to be the object of their thought, that they diverted their thinking away from God and onto the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was a good tree, perfectly good tree. But again, it was something that took greater priority. It was something that they basically inverted the hierarchy. They turned the contingent good into an ultimate good, and they turned God, the ultimate good, into a contingent good. So, and even in questioning that, whether God is actually good in his prohibition of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that's basically where I would go with that. So it's not as though God created evil. No, God created everything good, but human beings freely chose to set their minds on things below, on lesser goods, on contingent goods, rather than on the greatest or the ultimate good. So let me move on from there. We have miles to go before we sleep. So let me try to move on from here to the next section. If we get rid of the biblical God, then our best hope for addressing the redemption from evil is now removed. There is no hope for deliverance from evil, or at least no significant hope. Some people say, oh, you can get rid of, you can, through reincarnation, you can eventually, if you realize that you are divine, or that your soul is ultimately the same as God, or Atman is Brahman, then you are no longer going to be part of this wheel of karmic birth, death, and rebirth, but you'll be freed from that. So I'd say that that's again, it doesn't have any sort of robust deliverance from evil, because in a lot of Hindu schemes or ways of looking at things, there is no real robust understanding of good and evil. For one thing, there's no accounting for how evil even emerged in the first place. But again, I won't get into a lot of detail here, but I'll just move on to looking at the deliverance from evil in the Christian understanding, and see how that actually makes sense. And again, I even quoted Francis Spofford, who realized he needed mercy, and he found the Christian faith supplied that mercy. But in a world of evil, what has God done to help humanity? Again, an important question for us to be asking. What has God done? If there is a God that exists, has this God stepped in to do anything? Well, I think here we have some great responses from the biblical faith. That in the Christian faith, God gets his feet dirty and his hands bloody as he steps into history to redeem and to restore us. As we've seen, we're incapable of saving ourselves, contrary to other worldviews or religions or philosophies of life, where there's self-salvation. We can figure things out. We can build this tower, and we can make a name for ourselves. We can rescue ourselves. No, we need outside assistance. We've seen human failure over and over again, and we know that we need some assistance from beyond our own resources, what the scriptures call grace. Of course, Tim Keller says that if this is your starting point, if this is your recognition that when you recognize that we need this help, that there is this God who steps into the world, who prays for his enemies as he dies for them, this is going to produce the kind of life that the early Christians produced. The truth is that God became weak, loving, dying for humans who opposed him, dying, forgiving them. Again, this is a powerful picture, something we often take for granted. Alvin Plantinga says, as the Christian sees things, God doesn't stand idly by. He endures the anguish of seeing his son, the second person of the Trinity, consigned to the bitterly cruel and shameful death on the cross. Some theologians claim that God cannot suffer. I believe that they are wrong. God's capacity for suffering, I believe, is proportional to his greatness. The historian Tom Holland says this about Christianity. He says, the longer I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, the more alien and unsettling I came to find it. It was not just the extremes of callousness that I came to find shocking, but the lack of sense that the poor or the weak might have any intrinsic value. As such, the founding conviction of the Enlightenment that it owed nothing to the faith into which most of its greatest figures had been born increasingly came to seem to me unsustainable. Every sensible man, Voltaire wrote, every honorable man must hold the Christian sect in horror. Yet, Campbell writes, or Holland writes, Voltaire in his concern for the weak and oppressed was marked more enduringly by the stamp of biblical ethics than he cared to admit. We preach Christ crucified, St. Paul declared, unto the Jews a stumbling block and unto the Greeks foolishness. He was right. Nothing could have run more counter to the most profoundly held assumptions of Paul's contemporaries, Jews or Greeks or Romans. The notion that God might have suffered torture and death on a cross was so shocking as to appear repulsive. Familiarity with the biblical narrative of the crucifixion has dulled our sense of just how completely novel a deity Christ was. In the ancient world, it was the role of gods who laid claim to ruling the universe to uphold its order by inflicting punishment, not to suffer it themselves. Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in a post-Christian society still take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I'm not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. God has indeed stepped into this world and has again begun reshaping the world through people who have been impacted by that message of a God who comes, who dies for a lost humanity, dies forgiving them while on the cross. So we have, again, a very powerful statement that Tom Holland made there. But there's more to consider. The Christian faith gives us resources of not only a God who steps into the world, but again guarantees that in the end, cosmic justice is going to be done. There will be a resolution to evil. But without God, this kind of cosmic justice becomes impossible. There's no way, if there is no God, that Hitler and Stalin could have any different an outcome than Mother Teresa, with all of her sacrifice for God. Both Hitler and Stalin, along with Mother Teresa, they all meet the same fate. Justice, cosmic justice, is not done. When it comes to earthly justice, we think it would be a terrible society if murderers and rapists were never called to account or punished for their actions. Well, why not cosmic justice? See, unlike atheism, the existence of a good God guarantees that justice will be carried out in a cosmic way, that wrongs will be set right. No one will get away with murder, and self-sacrifice for God and for others will not be in vain. You see, God's existence not only brings cosmic justice, but guarantees that ultimately happiness and virtue will come together. God brings the two together. Atheism leads to the absurdity that are the deepest longing that we have for joy and happiness, but will not be fulfilled by those who have lived virtuous but unrewarded earthly lives like Mother Teresa. You see, the Christian faith presents a two worlds model in addressing the problem of evil. Atheism has only one world available within which to address evil, and it leaves many problems unresolved. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4, "For our light and momentary afflictions are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." God guarantees that everything will be made right, and even the afflictions that we face in this life are nothing in comparison to what will be revealed in the future. Think of the factory girl in Elizabeth Gaskell's novel, North and South. She says, "I think if this should be the end of all, and if all I have been born for is just to work my heart and life away, and to sicken or to be sickened in this dreary place with those millstones in my ears forever until I could scream out for them to stop, and let me have a little peace of quiet, and with the fluff filling my lungs until I thirst to death for one long deep breath of the clear air, and my mother gone and I never able to tell her again how I loved her. And of all my troubles, I think if this life is the end, and that there is no God to wipe away all tears from all eyes, I could go mad." So what does the atheist say to this person who's working in the factory, slogging it out? Again, feeling this sense of drudgery, no joy in the life that she lives to sustain herself. Again, if God exists, then again, this perspective becomes brilliantly clear. Keep in mind too that in a world of evil, not only has God done something, but God's action in the world has spurred on God's people to bring heavenly realities to a broken world through missionary endeavor, through social action and so forth. So let's talk about that very briefly. The atheist philosopher Jürgen Habermas says basically that Christianity has brought to us, and of course the Jewish sense of justice, these have brought to us egalitarian universalism, individual morality of conscience, human rights, and democracy. He says these are the direct heir to the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love, and that any other attempt to explain this is just idle, postmodern talk. Even the atheist Jacques Derrida says the concept of crime against Christian concept, and I think there'd be no such thing in the law today, like the notion of crimes against humanity, without heritage, without the Abrahamic heritage, without the biblical So again, even atheists acknowledging the strong debt that is owed by civilization to the biblical faith being lived out. Luc Ferry talks about the Christian idea of human equality was unprecedented at the time, and one to which our world owes its entire democratic inheritance. And here's a story, or kind of the narrative of Brian Stewart, who had been a journalist. He's retired, but he tells about how he found Christ by following Christians around the world in the worst possible spots to go. He says, I found there is no movement or force closer to the raw truth of war, famines, crises, and the vast human predicament than organized Christianity in action. There's no alliance more determined and dogged in action than church workers, ordained and lay members when mobilized for a common good. It is these Christians who are right in the front lines of committed humanity today, and when I want to find that front, I follow their trail. It is a vast front stretching from the most impoverished reaches of the developing world to the hectic struggle to preserve caring values in our own towns and cities. I've never been able to reach those front lines without finding Christian volunteers already in the thick of it, mobilizing congregations that care, and being a faithful witness to the truth, the primary light in the darkness, and so often the only light. He says, now I came to this admiring view slowly and reluctantly. At the start of my career, I'd largely abandoned religion, for I too regarded the church as a rather tiresome irrelevance. What ultimately persuaded me otherwise, and I took a lot of persuading, was the reality of Christianity's mission, physically and in spirit, before my very eyes. Rodney Stark came to similar conclusions. He, back in 2006, had been an agnostic at Baylor University teaching, again, talked about the impact of the Christian faith in history and so forth. And I wrote to him in 2011, and I said, I noticed you claimed to be an agnostic back in 2006. Where do things stand right now? And he wrote me back and he said, I basically wrote myself into the Christian faith. He saw the impact that the Christian faith has made in history, that it's making around the world today. And it was these things that persuaded him about the truth of the gospel, that theoretically sent, but it also is being lived out in everyday life. So there's a practical argument to be made for the Christian faith, as Rodney Stark saw it played out in history. Now, this brings us to the final point here. Again, why should we consider the Christian faith? Well, it makes better sense of the alternatives. But again, it's not without our taking a particular position on the matter. You see, our will needs to be involved here. We need to, for the skeptic, and again, some of the conversations, some of the questions that have been raised during our discussion by the listeners here, they presuppose that, again, some of the critics of the Christian faith presuppose that they should be able to see the rational picture and kind of assess things pro and con. But again, so often what is left out is the volition or the will. You see, everyone is going to take a stance when it comes to the problem of evil. And we need to engage the imagination and ask the question, could it be the case that God has revealed himself in history? Could it be that God has revealed himself in Jesus Christ to address the problem of evil, to bring about a new creation, to conquer death, to conquer sin, to guarantee that every tear will be wiped away and that cosmic justice will be done, that happiness and virtue will be united in the end? You see, we'll all privilege one vantage point over against another. The question is, why do I privilege one vantage point over against another? The atheist might privilege an experience of evil, maybe the abandonment of a parent, the loss of a child, over another thing, like the goodness of God or the sacrifice of Christ for humanity. Which will I privilege? Will I take my own limited vantage point? Will that be what now shapes how I look at the problem of evil and how I work it through in my own mind? Or is there something different, something greater, something much more cosmic even than my own perspective that brings all of these pieces together? You see, the stance that we take, whether skeptical or trusting, is going to shape or distort our understanding of God, the world, and so forth. But Christians have focused on this issue differently based on scripture and Jesus, and of course, philosophical reasoning too, because they believe that in the Christian faith, there is a better focus, an explanation that does a better job than any other that we recommend, that we encourage people to look here rather than elsewhere to address the problem of evil in a larger and more robust perspective. So the questions we have to ask are, will we privilege our doubts or skepticism over against what God has done for us in Christ? Will we give priority to the problem of evil and our distressing experiences over against a God who loves us and suffers with us? Even goes through crucifixion on our behalf. Will we assume that this world is the only reality that there is, and that people will ultimately get away with murder, or that virtue will ultimately go unrewarded for so many people? Or will we trust that God is the only guarantor for securing cosmic justice and setting right all of these world's wrongs? Will we agree with the promises of God in Christ that he will recompense those who love him far beyond what we could imagine in this life? Will we place our trust in philosophies that can't assuage our guilt or cleanse our conscience, or help us overcome our fear of death, or give a stable purpose and meaning to our lives? Or will we trust the all-sufficient Christ, who secures our place in God's family, who promises full forgiveness and complete rest, joy, and peace in the life to come? So Jesus said, "My teaching is not my own, but his who sent me. If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak for myself." And I think we often have to engage our critics, engage those who are challenging the Christian faith about their willingness or readiness to consider the Jesus story. Could it be true? Is it possible that I could find my identity here rather than elsewhere? Does this biblical story prove reliable in making the best sense of the way things are, about my own human condition, about the general human condition, about the reality of evil, about my own sense of identity and purpose? G.K. Chesterton talks about the issue when belief in God becomes difficult. The tendency is to turn away from him. But in heaven's name, to what? You see, the atheist's key argument against God becomes even more difficult when we get rid of God. It is the Christian faith that actually brings to us these robust resources. Without Christ, what resources are we left with in addressing the deep problem of evil? The existence, the definition, and the presupposition of evil make the best sense in light of the biblical God. Without Christ, what hope do we have that the problem will be set right? We need a champion who steps in to do reparation, to bring redemption and resolution to the problem of evil. We see that God's modeling of love in Christ's death and his empowering spirit produce in God's people the motivation to action to help a hurting world. So those are some considerations as we look at the problem of evil, as we ask these questions. Well, if you get rid of God, if you get rid of Jesus, what are you left with? Well, we have to appeal to we've got a last resort argument here. If, even with all the problems that we have to address as Christians concerning the problem of evil, if you get rid of God, if you get rid of Jesus, the problems are made far worse. Well, anyway, those are a few thoughts on the problem of evil and God as the best explanation. And again, if nothing else, the last resort to address the problem of evil when we still feel plagued by the problem of evil as we're trying to address it. The alternatives are far less appealing intellectually. So anyway, those are a few thoughts, and now I'm happy to take any further conversation that you might have, any questions or comments that you'd like to bring to the conversation as we wrap up here. There's a question that came up here, and thank you for asking it. Do you have a book that summarizes what was discussed here? There's a book called God is Great, God is Good, co-edited by William Lane Craig and Chad Meister, published by InterVarsity Press. And I have a couple of chapters in there on the problem of evil, but it is a wide-ranging treatment of the problem of evil. Again, some of these arguments are going to be found within there, but again, I'm kind of developing different strands of argumentation to kind of developing this last resort argument from evil. So I've been just doing that recently, but again, I suppose this, having all, and I am happy to pass out these notes to you all who have been part of this. I'll make my PDF file available to Jose, and he can distribute this to those of you who have been part of this discussion. But again, I'll make that available for you, so at least this would be a starting point for you all. Yeah, okay, we have Elka affirming that this topic is so critical in conversations who don't want to entertain Jesus. I think you're right, and I think it is important that we not only give the intellectual reasons, and I think even some of those existential reasons, like how do we deal with our guilt, how do we deal with our shame, how do we deal with maybe even the fear of death, how do we deal with again, the brokenness that we see in the world. Again, the Christian faith addresses these sorts of things in terms of concrete action and God's forgiveness of us, etc. But I think it's also important that we engage the will of those with whom we're speaking, that it's not merely an intellectual concern. And so often many people who are hostile to the Christian faiths, again, strongly resistant to it, I sometimes will get into conversations about them as to why they have such a hostile perspective, why they are almost angry with God. And a lot of times it has to do with maybe their own experience of the problem of evil. There's a book that was written by Paul Vitz called Faith of the Fatherless, in which he looks at the world's leading atheists all the way from the 1600s unto the 21st century, including some of the new atheists. And one of the things that he sees in common is that they all have, virtually to a person, a negative to a non-existent relationship with their own fathers or father substitutes. Whether this be Jean-Paul Sartre, Friedrich Nietzsche, Madeleine Murray O'Hair, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, on down the list, Karl Marx, etc. They all have these negative to non-existent relationships with these fathers or father substitutes. And so, again, it doesn't disprove atheism, of course. That would be called the genetic fallacy. But it does remind us that sometimes the arguments from evil, the arguments against God, it doesn't matter how much rational argumentation we give, there will be some embedded emotional issues that are not going to be overcome, or unless, say, the will is engaged, and we can, and people are willing to look at things differently. But so often we interpret the reality of God, the goodness of God through our own experiences, and rather than letting God be the paradigm, we project the failure of our own earthly fathers. I mean, I had a wonderful earthly father, but a common experience is a negative earthly father, and therefore the inference that is made is that, well, God must somehow resemble my earthly father or my earthly experience, and therefore that shapes, or I'd say distorts one's understanding of how one should think about God, how one should approach God. So again, there are those deeper issues that also need to be addressed, and sometimes it's important for us to listen to the stories of people who have gone through some of these difficult times. And it's very interesting to just hear those stories played out often in conversation. You see that kind of hostility or anger. There's often something more going on. I've seen more people turn away from Christ because of those human experiences. And and the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 5 said, the love of constrains us. Of course, he's talking about the gospel with others, and knowing that we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. But the love of Christ constrains us in other ways too, doesn't it? It constrains how we look at our own, maybe we had a negative earthly father figure in our lives. Maybe there's been abandonment, and there's been abuse or something. Well, that's not where we ought to begin. We ought to begin with what the norm is. Even if you think about the issue of evil, we talked about evil as a departure from the way things ought to be. When we look at these negative human experiences, we say that's a departure from the way things ought to be. What is the way things ought to be? And that's where we are actually pointed in the direction of God. So we need to begin with what is that standard rather than trying to, rather than moving from the negativity, the departure, the corruption of that standard and letting that shape how we look at that standard. C.S. Lewis said we wouldn't know what is crooked unless we have an idea of what straight is. So we need to make sure that we go to the straight rather than, in a sense, letting the crooked shape our thinking. Well, I think we can wrap up on this then. Thank you all for your participation in this conversation. It's been good to be with you, and look forward to the next time we can do this sort of a thing. And thanks, Jose, for moderating and for your involvement from start to finish on this.